Well, welcome everybody. I'm David Burton. I'm the director of the Grace Hudson Museum, joined by Alyssa Bogue, curator of the James Krenov exhibition, Krenov School exhibition, and of course by Brendan Gaffney, our special guest tonight, James Krenov's biographer. I'm just going to make a few announcements before we get going, and then I'm going to ask Alyssa to introduce Brendan, and then Brendan's going to have about a 40-minute PowerPoint presentation. We're going to try to leave a lot of room for questions and reminiscences at the end of the program, towards the end of the program. So hopefully you'll all stick around, and we want to hear from you. First, I want to start by acknowledging the traditional caretakers of the land. Grace Hudson Museum is in southern Mendocino County, and along with Lake and Sonoma counties, our neighboring counties, we share an area that is the ancestral homelands of the Pomo peoples. And at the Grace Hudson Museum, we strive to honor this land by bringing truth and nuance to the human stories we tell. And from wherever you are joining us, we urge you to get to know the history, experience, and cultures of the native peoples in your area. Okay, let's get to it. I'm going to ask Alyssa to take over and introduce Brendan. Again, I just want to compliment Alyssa on what a fabulous job she did curating the show, and also want to give a shout out to the members of the advisory committee, which includes Laura Mays, Carrie Marshall, David Welter, and Tina Krenov. So take it away, Alyssa.
Yeah. So it's so lovely to have Brendan here today. He was a great help with the exhibition and his book, James Krenov, Leave Fingerprints, was a great resource for the exhibition as well. So if you get a chance, you want to find out more. There's so much more. Yeah, that was a great picture to flip to. Brendan went to this school, and then of course he wrote Krenov's biography. And he also does a lot of different things. So you should check out his website. He also works at a fabrication space at Hartwick College in Oneonta right now. And I think we'll leave it there. And just a quick note, if you have questions throughout, please put it in the chat. We might ask a couple questions throughout, and at the end, we'll have a time if you'd like to share your memories of Krenov. And it will be recorded, and it will be put online at some point in the future. So without further ado, Brendan Gaffney.
All right. Well, thank you so much first to David and Alyssa and everyone else at the museum there. Am I on screen now? I hope so. So yeah. I'm Brendan Gaffney. I think I know like a good 80% of the attendants looking at the list shortly, and I've met almost all of you in person. So I won't go too long into it. But I'm here now in Otsego, New York. I think I wrote most of the book in Kentucky, but now we live here in upstate New York. What I want to talk about tonight is a part of Krenov's life that is not strictly documented that well, at least in his own tellings, about sort of the start and eventual success in coming to America, doing the song and dance. It's a phrase he used quite a bit. To do that, and because I wrote the biography, I can't help but at least do a cursory biography. I'm going to try to keep it brief. A lot of you will know this. Some of you won't, but also something that I think is important to share were a lot of the kind of the things that I found that I thought were really wonderful to see and were surprises to me when I went beyond knowing Krenov as the person who founded the school I went to, and went into trying to learn as much as I could about him, about James Krenov, the man. And his life. So I'm going to pull up my slides here, and we're going to leap into the 21st century here, hopefully, where my slides are going to magically appear behind me. It says they're loading right now. So yes, and there we are. Good. The song and dance, Krenov's American Dreams, and here behind me is actually the slide we'll end up ending on. So I'm going to try to blow through the biography. It's hard for me to do because, as you know, I wrote a couple hundred pages on it, but I'm going to try to do my best. And I'm going to highlight a few points in the biography that I think are important to talk specifically about him coming back to America. So his story really starts with his mother's story, Julia Krenov, and his father, who were effectively Russian nobility of a sort, at least certainly in the upper crust of Russian society. And if you know anything about 1918, 1919, 1920 Russia, it was maybe a hard time, maybe for the first time, a hard time to be Russian upper class, and they wound up in far eastern Siberia, first in Irkutsk. His father was studying law, wound up in a posting in Okosk, I think. I'm forgetting the name exactly, where his father got a set up with a mine owner, and eventually Julia, his mother, heard about a posting at a tiny little school in the easternmost settlement in Siberia. So really something like 50 miles from the coast of Alaska and several thousand from Moscow or from St. Petersburg, where they started. So the far-flung reaches, which is where little at his birth, Dmitry Dmitrovich Krenov, soon thereafter, I'm not sure exactly when, known as Jim or James Krenov, was born. And there's little tiny Jim in Welland is the name of the settlement, in a real sort of traditional Chukchi outfit there. The Krenovs were quickly, the Russian Revolution reached even far off Chukotka Oblast. Krenov's father, according to one database I found online, was actually the imperial governor very, very briefly, for something like 4 months, of this far-flung Siberian oblast or state. I think probably because he was maybe the only known loyal or at least imperially appointed person in the area. But they soon had to flee. They fled through North America and eventually down to Shanghai, to this house on Bubbling Spring Road in Shanghai. And that house might tell you a little bit about, this was his father's father's house, where they were working as architects, which is what his grandfather had done, as well as being a watercolorist and talented artist, and clearly quite well to do. While in Shanghai, they spent much of their time on Putu Island, where the monks actually built them a house. They asked to stay on the island, and I guess it wasn't exactly a place with hotel rooms, but when they asked, according to Julia's memoirs, which is where a lot of this information comes from, they built them what Julia, I think, probably kindly described as a shack, which was eventually blown down in a typhoon, luckily not with the Krenovs in it. There's a young Jim. Jim is what his mother calls him, so it's hard not to call him Jim at this stage in life, but Jim there with his mother in Putu. Shanghai was not, they were in Shanghai for 3 years. Eventually, Krenov's father's parents, his grandparents, decided to leave for Europe. Julia gives a few reasons why they didn't join. One was she didn't want to have this 3-year-old making the trip across the Indian Ocean and I think potentially around the Horn of Africa to get to Europe. And also, I suspect she wrote sort of unfavorably about kind of being under, not under the thumb of her in-laws, but not enjoying her time there, especially after her time among native people in Siberia. She seemed to have kind of caught, not the bug, but had become deeply fond of spending time in these remote places with these indigenous people, and I think had almost sort of absorbed some of their look into the world. So this is a photo taken, I'm blocking the credits, but this is taken at a studio in Seattle, where in 1923, in October, so basically around Jim's 3rd birthday, they wound up in Seattle. And in Seattle, they worked, his parents worked odd jobs. His father, I think at one point was listed as working in a cannery. His mother wrote about working as basically a live-in nanny. Neither job was particularly befitting them. These are, his mother, I think, spoke 3 or 4 languages, was very highly educated. And his father had been studying as a lawyer in Irkutsk on Lake Baikal only a few years prior. So these jobs probably didn't fit them well. And long story short, they found a posting with the BIA, with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, to take a job up in Sleepmute, Alaska, which is here. Sleepmute is up the Kuskokwim River, living, I think, with the Yupik people, or Athabascan is, I think, the language group. It wasn't clear to me exactly which tribe they were staying with, but they were in Sleepmute, which is today a Yupik town, and very, very remote. Obviously, this is, many days by ship to get there even from Anchorage. So far, far out. And there's young Jim sitting in the classroom there with his classmates. Obviously, certainly the only Russian, certainly only person with any white European heritage. And he would talk later about it being a somewhat lonely childhood. I think possibly because he was didn't particularly fit in among kids his age. He would talk about them saying, "We'll play yesterday," and things like that. He didn't really maybe understand how to have a social life there. But he spent much of his childhood somewhat self-reliant. Talked a lot about the little boats he built, the knife that he got in an airdrop, and also spent a lot of time through his mother, who was writing and working to take down the stories and tales, both of the Chukchi people and eventually the Athabascan people they stayed with. So seeing a lot of writing, doing a lot of reading, certainly. Eventually the family, after being there, I think for 4 years, I have my notes here, which is why you see me glancing at the floor. Yeah, so they were in Sleepmute for 4 years. In 1928, they returned to Seattle. I think basically went through a similar situation where they took jobs, weren't particularly fulfilled, and signed up for another stint, this time a 3-year stint in Teonek, Alaska. There's a young, kind of right over my head, watching the tribe skin a beluga whale and harvest, I believe, harvest its blubber. I remember doing research on this image and trying to figure out exactly what they might be doing, but that is, I think, a narwhal. Or beluga, sorry. Spent another 3 years in Teonek and eventually wound up back in Seattle. There's the porch in Teonek, and there's a couple of great photos that I think his father, but maybe his mother, took. They were in a photo album put together by his mother. And there's another great photo of him reading on that porch in that chair. The family returned to Seattle, and it's around this time that his parents separated, and he wound up living on Alki Point in a small brick home, him and his mother. And they would stay there from 1933 to 1947. His mother worked as a translator for the WPA, among, I think, probably some other odd jobs. It's a long time to work for the WPA. I'm not sure they're still functioning fully by 1947. And Krenov went to high school. This is a favorite photo of mine that I found while I was doing research. There's James Krenov in his Letterman W Club Letterman jacket. But at this point, he's certainly has the appearance, and a lot of the stories he tells are that of a young kid in Seattle. It's interesting at this point in the biography, or in the research, or in the reading of the story, to try to consider what he might have thought of himself. Was he a young American kid? Was he a Russian? Was he, he'd spent at this point, or at least at age, 13, had spent most of his life with native peoples in the far north. It's interesting to think of his identity, or what he might have considered himself. But he was a naturalized citizen of America, of the United States at this point. In 1947, of course, it's important to talk about Captain Coffin, who Krenov mentions later in his writings, who lived down the street from him. I was lucky enough to go to Seattle and actually find the place where his house was. There's now an apartment building there. But also Captain Coffin's house is still there. And this was from a local history group on Alki Point. But Captain Coffin was an older sea captain who'd piloted, I believe, the ship Tacoma, which is sort of a famous ship at the time in the area. And Captain Coffin, along with Jim's other friends at the time, they would advise him on boat building and, all these sort of self-sufficient entertainment that you might go through were you a kid growing up on the ocean, or on the Sound, I should say. He also worked after graduating and maybe a little older. He worked at a couple of chandleries and boat builders. This is the Sund Endeavors. I heard it pronounced a few ways, which was a chandlery, a boat outfitter, and at Jensen Motorboat, which is actually not still there. It closed a few years ago, but is in Seattle and was a boat builder of some repute. But come 1947, here's the passport photo, which is an easy way to date exactly what it looks like at exactly a point in time. So this is him at 27. They moved to Sweden, his mother and he. I heard various stories about why that may have been. Jim talks in one of his books about hearing that there was work. He heard from people around him in Seattle who were from Scandinavia. I guess there was a Finnish population and maybe other Scandinavians, that there was good work there. He talks about, he's from a restless family and he was ready to go on an adventure. I also heard that his mother had talked about wanting to return to Russia, potentially. And at this point in 1947, so the war is over. Animosity between Russia and Western Europe was at least not at its peak, and Sweden, which had stayed neutral through the war, I think was thought of as a good launching point potentially for a return to Russia. So they went to Stockholm. This is a photo of one of the factories in Stockholm at the time. I couldn't get a note for which factory exactly. He mentions a light bulb factory at one point, but this is a factory in 1948 in Stockholm. And that's where Krenov, upon landing, took a job. He took a job at the factories and talks about how much he loved the factories because he could quit come springtime and come the thaw, especially in the north, in northern Sweden, where he was fond of adventuring and backpacking. And he could quit his job, go backpacking and adventuring, and then come back in the fall or in the late summer and sign right back up. There was always work. So, and at this same time, this is, oh God, Tina's here. So I won't pronounce any Swedish. At this time, he wrote, he started writing professionally these travelogue, memoir, adventure stories. It's hard to pin them down in one way because at times he would use a third person narrator and actually would use a name that wasn't his. He would write about a Michael or something, but they were really about his travels. This was in Dagens Nyheter in 1950. So this is The Singing Hearts. I hope I've translated that correctly. And also, I think, is that The Castle? Yeah, Castle. So these were published in the newspaper. And actually, one of the things that was not a revelation for me, I sort of had the sense that he must have been a writer before his woodworking books, but the extent to which he was writing, even as a younger man than this, he was writing stories all the way back. I think the earliest dated one that was in his papers that Tina so kindly let me look through might have been something like 1944 or even younger. So he was writing as a very young man. And upon going to Sweden and going on these adventures, both to continental Europe and to the northern reaches of Sweden, Scandinavia, he made a profession of it. So he started publishing and was published in newspapers. I think mostly in Dagens Nyheter was where his stories appeared. I think there was one in Svenska Dagbladet. And again, I'm sorry, Tina, for my pronunciation. Yeah, I have little this is, oh, it's going to be messy, but he was published, this first book he was published in that I could find. He had a story published called Free. Yeah, there. In the 1951 Swedish Tourism Handbook. Oh, the screen is going to fight me. Well, anyway, you'll have to trust me. So that's 1951. Only a few years later, wait 1 second. He also had Italian Sgresa, which was fully his book. Let's see if it will let me present this. Oh, don't fight me. You have to trust me on that too. Italian Sgresa, which was a travelogue he wrote about his time in Italy, in post-war Italy. On that trip, but not in the book. He wrote the book originally talking about a Michael, so it wasn't first person. It wasn't obviously him in the book. But on that trip with him was his, at that point, wife, Britta. It's important to, if we talk about Jim, to talk about Britta. They met, I think, first in 1949 in Paris. Jim said was getting a book back that someone had borrowed, and that book had wound up in the hands of this young woman whom he got it back from, and whose information he lost, or his contact information he lost. So he wound up running into her by chance in Stockholm a year later, and in his words, they were never apart again. At least they launched their relationship then. And okay, there's a little jump biographically, but basically, from 1951, they have their first daughter in 1953, I believe. I'm going to look at my notes again. It's been a little while since I wrote the book, so I do have to look at my notes. They're married in 1951, and Britta's actually pregnant on his Italian trip that he writes about. And after his first daughter's birth, Katya's birth, Krenov wrote a note to Britta saying he felt a calm new responsibility, I think sort of saying that he wanted to settle down and stop traveling or stop moving around as much. And by his account, he took factory work and I think basically stopped his sort of itinerant, semi-employed, or at times traveling quite a bit lifestyle to settle down. Lucky for him, Britta was certified as a teacher not that long afterwards, I think in 1956. Yeah, that's what my note says at least. And with that certification and her regular teaching job, Jim said that Britta encouraged him to find sort of his path, his career. And that path was in woodworking. I think Tina told me at one point, perhaps, or Katya told me that at one point, perhaps he had shared a shop with maybe one of their babysitters' boyfriends or husbands. It's not totally clear why woodworking. He had been working on boats. He certainly, was good with a carving knife, but we don't know exactly why he chose woodworking. He says that he chose Carl Mommsen School, the Verkstadskola, where he wound up, because of a chance encounter with the furniture on one of the shopping streets in Stockholm. So these are two photos of Jim at the Verkstadskola, which he attended from 1957 to 1959. He was an unusual student, as described by his classmates. We should say it was Carl Mommsen School. Carl Mommsen, sort of the father of Swedish traditional furniture, and that's simplifying it. Half of the books on one of the shelves behind me are just Mommsen's books on furniture. They're lengthy, and he did a lot, certainly. He's a very active contributor. But there's Jim and Carl. And here are some of his classmates. Jim's all the way on one end. On that end, I have to mirror my movements. And this was his first encounter with formal woodworking education, and also really his first encounter with woodworking, rather, or cabinet making and furniture making, certainly. He would go on to have a relationship with Mommsen, quite a close one. He was noted as a translator and someone who helped with the purchase of the land for Kapellagården, which became one of Mommsen's schools, and an important one to Mommsen's story, and certainly still today. And in the CR story, in the College of Redwoods or the Krenov School story, we still my year, we hosted an exchange student from there, and one of our students spent the first semester there. So very quickly, this is an article from 1960, so just a year after graduation, and Krenov has already got a cabinet printed in the newspaper there in the top left of that page. Interestingly, there's also another one of his cabinets in the center of the page there, but it was printed upside down by the newspaper. But I got to see that cabinet that's in the top left there. It's with someone owns it in the States now, and it's amazing to think that already it is certainly a sort of somewhat traditional Swedish piece, but you can see already the touches, the carved bowls. It's, I think, cherry wood and Oregon pine. There's a lot of early but already familiar sort of signatures of Krenov's work. And I love this. Krenov was a spoon carver. That's a martini spoon. I'm hiding the caption again, but down in the bottom right there, you can see Krenov's name spelled with a W. I got a lot of new research material when I realized that the Swedes often spelled his name with a W instead of a V. But there's his cocktail spoon. In 1964, the Form Fantasy exhibition was launched. Dag Vidman, who was the leader of the Swedish Craft Association, became an early champion of gyms. This exhibition was a big sort of taste-making exhibition at the time, and launched I think a lot of careers, but interestingly, I think there were 250 artists, maybe something like that, featured, and I think over 2,000 works, something like that. I have the numbers written down somewhere else. But of all those pieces, here in this little review that was printed in the Svenska Dagbladet, of the two images, one of them is one of Krenov's silver chests. So obviously he's already receiving a warm reception. And here's his first solo exhibition, Life and Work, that was in Stockholm. So from 1959, finishing his education, already to 1965, doing solo shows, which is pretty good. I think if you ask most furniture makers that came through our school, you'd be happy with that kind of rise. Important to his story here, and important to where we're trying to get, which is talking about his first ventures to America, or his first returning ventures to teaching in America. Krenov was a naturalized citizen of the United States, which meant that he had to return to the United States, I think, every 3 years, or he would lose his citizenship. And at this point, I believe certainly by 1965, well, certainly by 1960, I believe he'd lost his citizenship. And someone he knew at the time, Harley Sachs, who I was lucky enough to speak with for writing the book, mentioned that he had no passport. He was effectively a stateless person until there was, I have the legal case, Schneider v. Rusk, ended that requirement. So Krenov regained his citizenship in, I think, 1964 or 65. So the court case was in 1964. I believe by 1965, he would have had his passport again. But all that is to say, I think it helps shine a light both on the fact that Krenov was pretty firmly planted in Sweden and Scandinavia at the time. It might explain why he wasn't returning to the US, or why he wasn't traveling further abroad or thinking of teaching. And why, starting in 1965, he seems to set his sights on teaching abroad, and that's where we're gonna get to here. Here's a nice article. I forget the date we're looking at, but already this is still mid 60s. We can see some pretty standard Krenov fare there, even at a very early time in his career. We've got a classic Krenov plane there. The music stand, and a few pieces that we know that's Jim. This man is Craig McCart. Craig McCart is sort of a central player in the story of Krenov getting to America. So Craig came, and I have to make sure I have my notes near me. Craig came first to Sweden on a Fulbright scholarship and studied at an art school in Stockholm, but actually, and was a student at RIT. Studying in Stockholm on a Fulbright, and actually sought out Jim I think after encountering one of his pieces at one of those shows, probably that I just mentioned, Form Fantasy or Life and Work, or through a mutual friend, and applied and successfully extended his Fulbright to actually work with Jim for the summer. And that one friendship became a real lifeline to Krenov's hopes to return to the United States. So Craig, after spending the summer with Jim, left with two impressions or two goals for Jim, or maybe at Jim's urging. The first was he carried back a short article, a short bit of writing that was to become Wood the Friendly Mystery, which was an early. I have some slides showing. This is what. This is the piece that Craig McCart made with Jim in his shop. It was a piano stool for a piano built by Georg Bolin, who's the teacher at the Mendocino School, and the chessboard that he helped design. So he and Krenov designed the chessboard together. That's Craig's first drawing. And there's a young Tina eventually at Craig McCart's wedding. But here is Wood the Friendly Mystery, which is the article that Craig McCart carried back and handed off to Rose Slivka, who was the editor at Craft Horizons. And this article, I think it's wonderful to read now, especially if you've read Jim's other books, because it's short. I think it's 2.5 pages. It's sort of continued at the back of the magazine. But in that short article is really the nucleus of certainly Cabinet Maker's Notebook. And you can also see here in that little comment, which you can squint to read, or I'll tell you, that this coincided also with Craig McCart helping arrange a show of Jim's cabinets in Pittsburgh, New York, which is just outside Rochester, again, probably associated with RIT and Craig's time there. And the other thing Craig came back with was the understanding that Jim was interested in teaching. And especially teaching in America. So Jim had been lecturing at times at the Malmsten Werkstattschule, where he was an alumnus. It's a hard time. My research was pretty scant for this. A lot of the people who were there didn't know or didn't have many resources to talk about. But my understanding is that he went sort of fell in and out of love with teaching at the Werkstattschule for various reasons. At one point, I think he was noted as a lecturer, but was never formally noted in anything I could find as a lecturer. So whether he was just being invited to give a short talk or to give a short demonstration, he was fielding students from the school. But it's clear that he was ready to look abroad. At the same time, he's also writing for Form magazine, which is a Swedish language magazine published by the Swedish Craft Association, and Dag Vidman, who was the curator of that show that he was featured in. And his writings in Form get increasingly more sour on Swedish culture, on his outlook of where Swedish craft culture and appreciation is going. So again, another reason that he may be looking abroad. He can travel. He's got a passport now. And he's made a good friend and a good contact at RIT, and he's getting tired of teaching or working for the Swedish public, perhaps. So here is the workshop at RIT. I think I have a second photo here. RIT, at this time, it was the School for American Craftsmen, and was an attempt to bring a sort of European trade / craft / art / industrial arts kind of program, refined and highly skilled program to the United States, where such programs maybe didn't exist or weren't as common. One of the founding woodworking teachers there was Tay Frid. So if you know woodworkers, there's a name you know. Tay Frid, a real technical, fabulous woodworker, published some very influential books, which you can't see, but they're right behind me. By the late 1960s, the two teachers were Bill Kaiser, who was a student of Tay Frid's, and this man, Wendell Castle, Wendell Castle, some of you will know who that is, and certainly will know a lot about him if I won't put my foot in my mouth too bad. But he was really a sculptural art furniture craftsperson. And by the late 1960s, the school at RIT, the woodworking program, was pretty firmly divided. Bill Kaiser and Wendell taught on alternate days. We're teaching completely different, basically different approaches and different subjects. And by what reports I could find, the school really had an identity crisis of a sort, or at least the dean at the time thought that the students were getting a lot and watching the two sides fight, but maybe weren't getting one complete picture. So Bill Kaiser, for various reasons, like medical, took a sabbatical in 1969, and upon the urging of Craig McArt, James Krenov was hired to come over to teach for the year during Bill Kaiser's sabbatical. Oh, here's some stacked lamination, students hammering away at wood. So this man, Dean Brennan, hired Jim to come over and teach. Jim and Wendell Castle exchanged letters ahead of Jim coming out to teach. By all accounts, by Wendell's account, they were very friendly, very inspiring letters. They were excited to work with each other. And by all accounts, including students that I got to speak to who were there at the time, it did not work. For both the same reason that things had been hard with Bill Kaiser. There were two approaches between Krenov and Wendell Castle, but also by all reports, there was an immediate interpersonal disagreement between Wendell, who was not there to give technical and as much technical advice, but was almost maybe more doing critiques and artistic work, and Krenov, who insisted that the furniture lacked technical talent and things, there were gaps in joints and things were falling apart, and it didn't matter how sort of pretty they looked, to paraphrase. But Dean Brennan says, Dean Brennan said Wendell was intensely jealous of Krenov, and Krenov was intensely jealous of Wendell. So that was his remembrance. But he also goes on to say he would tell the students, "You're having an unparalleled opportunity to see two highly creative people. Now you don't have to believe either one of them, but observe them both and listen to them both, and there will come a time when you'll make a choice and say, well, he's talking more sense than he is, but the time isn't now." So Dean Brennan, I think at one point he says he should have been getting hazard pay for the cats and dogs going at it below him, but that he did think it was at least valuable to students. But by the second semester, I think story I heard from I think one of the students at the time, Jim had made himself a small workshop in the school in a storage closet, but was dissatisfied with the equipment, with the materials he could get. I think he wasn't driving or didn't have his own car, and I think even was living on campus. So he was increasingly, I think, dissatisfied. And again, I can't remember where the research this came up, but I think also he was upset he couldn't go home for the holidays. So by the second semester, Krenov, it blew up. One side of the story is that Krenov thought Wendell Castle was really neglecting students and actually reported him to the academic council. Wendell Castle tells the story in his oral history at the Smithsonian. He claims that Jim threatened to shoot him. I don't know. Again, I can't claim to. I'm not even sure I published that in the book because I'm not sure I could substantiate it beyond just something Wendell said. But for whatever reason, it exploded. And not only did Jim go home, basically at that point, it's not clear if he volunteered or was sent home, but he certainly left. But also Wendell left RIT and started working at the nearby SUNY school, where he would go on. I think Krenov would stay there that Wendell Castle would be at SUNY Brockport for many more years until he launched his private studio. But so that was RIT, and was not a success for Jim. But importantly, here's a letter that Dean Brennan wrote for Jim, recommending him, saying how great it's been to work with him. He's talking in the past tense here, but it's still only halfway through the first semester. I don't know what that says for his thoughts of what was coming. But he does say Krenov gave us a wealth of insights. He was a good force here. And this letter was, importantly, was used a few years later when Jim came back and actually taught summer programs in 1973 and 1974 at RIT. So he was not banned, though the longer term position seemed to have been not an option anymore. During this time when he returned, he met a number of people, Americans and Canadians too. Back in Stockholm, on the right here is Alan Marks. This is them, I think, having some kind of lunch at Alan Marks's apartment, I think in Stockholm. Alan Marks was a student at the Mendocino School, and later was in California, and I think now is maybe in Costa Rica. I spoke with him during the book. It's been a little while. Another visitor to Krenov's shop around this time was Martin Puryear, who came, sought out Jim after seeing his work in a museum. Learned he could look him up I think he looked him up basically in the Yellow Pages or the equivalent of the directory, and showed up at his house. And I think by his account, he was only there for a few weeks, and I think he said he, sort of dimensioned some wood and sharpened the carving gouges. But really what he remembered was the time he got to spend with Jim just talking about furniture. And Martin also cites this as a time when Jim was intensely against art being furniture or furniture being art, maybe influenced by his run-ins with Wendell Castle. Also interesting to note that Martin was the person who gave Jim the first copy of David Pye's The Nature and Art of Workmanship, The Art and Nature of Workmanship, which became, for those of us who read Jim's books, a very important book to Jim. But Krenov returned to RIT after a few years back, very productive years. There's a lot of furniture that gets made between 1969 and 1973. But he returns for 2 more summer stints. In 1973, he teaches the first of these summer stints and actually was in talks with the administration and was offered even the possibility of doing a full year, though later that summer there are letters. I think, I'm not sure I've posted the exact letters, but there are letters when the dean, who at the time now was Dean Johnson, and Craig McCart and another friend of his, Jed Brady, all write to say they regret that they're rescinding the offer of teaching there another full year and instead offer him another summer. So by some accounts, I think Bill Kaiser, who was by then back at RIT, was maybe not interested in teaching alongside Jim, or the nuances of those relationships are not known now. But certainly this possible hope of relocating or teaching full time. There is a nice quote somewhere along here, and I'll read just a second of it. Jim was writing to Jed Brady, who was an administrator at RIT, but was also taking Jim's woodworking classes, I think at night. But he says, "I would like to return to the US, to live and work there, teach if it's meant to be. I believe I could be a good teacher. Sometimes I allow myself to imagine how Craig McCart and I could work together. Stay a year to replace someone on sabbatical, hold some more summer courses, or even move back to the US if need be." And I think Tina, who's here on this call, even mentioned there was talk a little bit at home about a possible relocation, and that at this point, I think Tina's 13, 14 in 1973, 1974, was reluctant to move, understandably. But Krenov sort of was not giving up hope that he might find at least an audience or students in the US, and was encouraged, I think, by the students he did meet, even if the programs didn't work out, which led to his second return. Oh, and here are a few students he met that figured large. Rob Sperber is there on the left, who actually went into metalworking and became a Alaska chainsaw maker. And I believe the chainsaw mill at the school is one made by Rob Sperber. And this is the RIT wood drying shed they built that Rob Sperber and Joe Tracy and others, I'm sure, built at RIT, somewhat under the influence of Krenov's idea of making their own wood and getting closer to the source of their materials. But importantly, in his last serious attempt at teaching in America, before the College of the Redwoods, was the establishment of the Boston University program in artisanry. So the program in artisanry was effectively an attempt to launch something like what RIT had done in Boston. They hired Neil Hoffman, who had been an administrator at RIT, to launch the program. And when they started looking around for people to hire, they hired Jim on Craig Don McKinley's recommendation, who was a teacher up in Sheridan College, who became a longtime friend of Jim's, as well as a number of other people wrote these favorable letters for Jim. And so in January of 1975, Krenov got on a plane and arrived in Boston. And what he arrived to find was a non-starter school, unfortunately. Here's the announcement: comprehensive craft program. And you can read into some of these notes, or I don't know if this is one of the articles, but by all accounts, the first semester, which started halfway through the year in January, in the cold Boston, the program was totally not ready, not only for students, but for teachers, for facilities. Jim talked about, they had to have the heat on because obviously it's Boston in January, and it was in the room and it was deafening. So he had the choice of having the heat on and not freezing, but not being able to talk to the person next to you, or not having it on and freezing. One student, I think Michael Hurwitz, I spoke to a number of people that had eventually attend PIA later, who said they stopped in to look, or Garrett Hack actually, I think, told the story that he stopped in to look at the school, and he eventually attended, I think, the next year. But that first year he found, I think, Jim working alone in the classroom, like carving something or working on a piece of furniture. And he saw that people had made hand planes and they had ordered all of this beautiful wood, but the students were gone. I talked to another student, John Peterson, who was one. And so there were only 2 students that continued after that first semester of the 12. There were only 2 that were there the next fall. John was one of them. But he said, it wasn't Jim's fault, because by about halfway through that semester, Jim had already committed not to staying. Another one of his coworkers, I believe the ceramics teacher, the head instructor at the time, said that Jim was a fierce advocate for the students, I think is the quote, and just railed against the administration. I think they even had almost like a walkout at one point for how poorly things were being organized. Luckily, there's Michael Hurwitz. I got some great photos from the early PIA. But there's the eventual class, I think, of maybe a year or 2 later, the PIA after Jim's departure and a significant reworking. I think they fired and hired a dozen people. They wound up with what became a really wonderful woodworking program, but not Jim's program, not the Krenov School. In the bottom right there is Jerry Osgood. There's Alphonse Matias in the back, and they wound up with having some really incredible woodworkers coming out of that program, but not Jim's. At this point, I think, I'm getting towards as long as I should talk. So I'll start slowing down, but only to say that what would eventually be Jim's key to coming back across the Atlantic from Sweden, eventually for good, was the book. Jim was, the entire time he was at RIT, he was also working with Craig McCart to transcribe his dictated chapters of his book, which would become Cabinet Maker's Notebook. And while he was in Boston working at PIA, he was also going down to New York to meet with his eventual publisher, Van Nostrand Reinhold, and John Kofod, who I think I even have there's his little card that he sent in a book to Jim. And then this is also exchanges he had with John and Carolyn Grew Sheridan, who at one point potentially were going to be the editors of his book until I think sort of sounds like in modern parlance he ghosted them, or was working more with Craig and stopped working with them. But the book would be his ticket back to the West. The first book, 1976, and Cabinet Maker's Notebook, obviously really launched to a massively good reception. And a year later already, he came out with his second book, or a year and a few months. He was back in New York quickly working on that. And it was with these two books, this is the slide I'll end on. It was with those two books that he was able to come over and start giving lectures and tours. He saw the warm reception by American craftspeople of his book. He came over to give book tours, and almost all the way at the bottom there, oh, I've got to point this way, we see after a barn-busting tour across the United States, he wound up giving a short presentation at the University of California, Santa Cruz, which is in 1978. And that was the meeting where he met Brian Lee and I believe Gary Church and a few others, who convinced him to come up to Mendocino and give a presentation to their nascent woodworking guild. And it was that meeting and the eventual workshops they set up in the following summers that led to the establishment of College of the Redwoods, which is another story that is being told now at the Grace Hudson Museum in beautiful Ukiah, California. But I hope that helps shed some light on. I didn't talk a lot about aspirations. I talked a lot of facts, but where Jim was thinking about coming to America, why he came here, some of his trips here, and some of the splashes he made, and kind of helps fill in the story about his dreams of coming and teaching in America that were eventually fulfilled by the College of the Redwoods and what is now appropriately called the Krenov School. And that's where I'll slow down and stop and look here at questions. And if anyone wants to share their remembrances, I'm going to ask Alyssa to come back on too and help me
Yes.
coordinate that.
So we do have one question. And then if you would like to share some thoughts about Krenov or memories, feel free to either raise your hand, put it in the Q&A, or put it in the chat. And then we'll go to you and we can turn on your video and your audio. And just do keep in mind that this is being recorded and will eventually go online. The question that we have, was there any notable critical or public reaction to Krenov's pre-notebook era of writing? And related, could it someday warrant a reprint translation into English?
I bought 2 copies of Italian Scresa, and Eiler Horth West has the other one. So if you want to read Jim's 1955 book, you have to go bug Eiler down there in Elk and get a copy of it, but you'll also have to speak Swedish, which is why Eiler has it and not me. I read it with Google Translate. I found very little public reaction or review to that book and to the other writings. Not to say there wasn't any, but not a lot was preserved. I think I saw one. There was a bicycle riding group, a Swedish bicycle riding group or club that wrote favorably about his Italian trip. That's real niche literature review there. A cyclist club reviewing a book about a cycling trip. But I mean, it's, as someone who I worked at a magazine, you don't have an article. You don't have 10 articles. I think it was something like 10 or even maybe 15 stories published over the space of 5 or 10 years of these sort of travelogue half memoir stories. You don't have that many from one person if they're not, being well received, at least to some extent. But it wasn't, Cabinet Maker's Notebook, which was 1976, so many years sort of after this period where he was writing these short stories that were being published in the newspapers. Cabinet Maker's Notebook made a splash that was much, much bigger, certainly, and sold many, many, many more books. At one point, I think I spoke to someone at Sterling, but it was there's something like 1 million copies sold of that book over for many years. So, a million? No, now I feel like I'm misrepresenting. A lot of that book have sold and sold then. So, certainly not. That was, and he would often refer to that as his first book. So, maybe that's Krenov's own review of his early writing, or his early book. Yeah.
Tina has raised her hand, so I'm gonna
Yeah,
promote
good.
her to panelist and talk. Yeah.
Oh,
Hi, Tina.
And I'm wondering, Brendan, if you would like to stop sharing screen, and I
Oh,
wonder
yeah.
if that might.
Now I have to, let's see.
so I just raised my hand because I can't comment on anything in the Q&A. So
I thought
anyway,
opened
I
it.
want to just tell Brendan that I appreciate his talk and it was wonderful, and I love his anecdotes and the memories and insights that he shared.
Well, thank you so much, Tina. And yeah, and there are lots of people on this call, but I suspect Tina most of all, who were such a big part of getting this book together, and the generosity. I know Ron is here, Laura is here. I can't even see all the attendees. There are so many. So everyone was so helpful. But certainly none of this would have been possible without the community, without the school community and the family that are out there. It was deeply rewarding for me to write the book, and even now to go back and read about these sojourns in America, and think about, as someone who is now teaching at a school and is frustrated by the quality of perhaps the craft and technical skill of my students. It's reflective now, and will be, I'm sure, for a long time, for me to write and talk.
You did good, Brendan, and I appreciate it, and I think that it will go a long way to educate people.
Thanks. Thank you, Tina. Thank you so much.
Brendan, while we're waiting for some other people to share a memory or ask a question, I kind of want to follow up on what Tina was talking about. What motivated you to write this book?
Yeah.
How long did it take you to research? How long did it take you to write? Did you have a publishing deal ahead of time? Tell us some insight about that.
Yeah, I had the incredible privilege of having a deal or a contract when I started writing the book, which is really rare. But I was working at a woodworking publishing company. I had talked with my publisher, Christopher Schwarz, about Krenov at length. Chris and many people in the woodworking world who did not go to college at Redwoods or have not really interacted with it directly are very curious about it, and certainly about Krenov and his approach and his philosophy. And Chris and I had talked at length, and at one point he approached me. He said, I and everyone I know in woodworking have lots of questions about Krenov, and there's so little written about him. There's stuff that he wrote, but in terms of a wider scope of what he did before the books cover his Krenov's books. When I say the books, Krenov's woodworking books cover a very sort of narrow window into his life. They're 1976 there's 4 books there in pretty rapid succession. And so the image we have of him, certainly of his woodworking career, is a pretty sort of narrow window of time. And people have a lot of questions about it. So I was approached to write the book and given a contract. That day, I think I sat down and made a list of people that I knew I had to call. And that list was probably about 6 people long. And certainly some of them are on this call. And those 6 people were kind enough, if you were Ron and Linda Hawk, you put me up in your house. And if you're Laura, you tolerated lots of phone calls at all hours of the day about, isn't this crazy, this thing I just found out? Or Tina also let me in their home. It took me, I think from that day, it was 3.5 years until the book was published. I was not research and writing full time at that point. But it was a lot of slow burn. And then certainly the last year was almost exclusively writing the book. October 31st, 2020 was when we sort of launched the book, which was Jim's 100th birthday.
Mm-hmm.
Did you
Brandon, I have a question. You certainly got some feedback that was not favorable to
Yeah.
Jim's personality. How did you handle that?
Yeah. Well, and so I remember Chris Shores, when he approached me to write the book, he said, you know, he'd read some other things that people had written about Jim, that were very, very sweet, and spoke very highly of Jim. And lots of people speak very highly of Jim. And I don't wish to discount their memories, because he was an inspiring person for a lot of people. But certainly there were a lot of people who, as I mentioned, Wendell, Bill Kaiser being two of them, who did not get along with Jim, or butted heads. And there were stories of students and others, even before he was teaching, who butted heads. I did not omit anything from the book that, you know, I was told. I tried my best to give a full portrait of Jim. You know, it's not my hope to cast a light that I thought I could see. I was trying not to make a decision about what I thought of Jim or something like that. My goal was to gather stories and gather research and tell the story. I think, you know, and I think the book does that.
Yes.
We talk about Wendell. I think there's a quote from Gary Knox Bennett that might have an expletive in the book, you know, but also that is very much tells the story. And a word that a lot of people used, including Jim himself, I believe, was uncompromising. And that is a loaded word, certainly, but I think it rings true. Jim certainly stuck to his guns and had a vision for how he wanted, you know, things to go, and that certainly butted heads with people at times. But also, you know, if you look at the early syllabus of the class in 1981, I think you'll see a vision that was carried out pretty thoroughly, certainly with the help of people on this phone call and others. But you know, that vision was carried out, and that the school certainly had a deeply and profoundly positive impact on my life. So I owe something, and certainly a lot of that was Jim's vision.
Yeah, I think you did a very good job balancing that. Can you tell us a little bit more about my mom?
Yes, yes, Britta. If I were giving a talk about that was Jim's life, as in the book, Britta is really the second main character. Britta and Julia are the two other main characters of the story, certainly. And I would pull quotes, but it would involve me staring at my lap for too long. But there was a great quote at one point. I think Jim was visiting B.B. Johnson, who ran the Pridham and Eaves Gallery, and they were sitting at a table with a number of other furniture makers, maybe at a show or something. And one of the RIT people came up. I won't mention him by name because I think I know who it is, but I can't remember quite off the top of my head. But said, "Oh, you're Jim Krenov. You know, I heard up at RIT. I heard you're a real difficult person." And Britta, I think, without missing a beat, said, "Yes, and I'm Britta, and I'm a very patient woman." So, you know, so she was there to do so much. I was very lucky to meet Britta while I was a student, and while I didn't have Jim there to write the book with, and Britta wasn't there when I was doing my research. Britta is certainly remembered fondly by everyone.
Thank you, Brendan. I'll shut up now.
No, that's
By the way, in the chat box, Hawk Tools has provided a link to how you can purchase leaf fingerprints. Thank you, Hawk Tools.
thank you, Ron.
Yeah.
Send him his commission check in the mail.
Okay, someone must have a memory that they want to share with us today.
We're gonna twist arms.
Yeah,
Oh, there's so many people here. I'm sorry we're not doing this in person. There's so many people I'd love to see and shake their hands.
Ask people for their memories.
speak up. I just did.
Any other questions, comments? I know many of you have memories of Krenov. I've spoken to a couple of you myself. But we won't call on anybody.
Okay, well, we have
I know, I won't
have
call
a
him.
very shy bunch tonight.
That's fine.
So,
All
right.
questions were answered.
yeah,
Are done.
James, I'm sorry, Brendan. Yeah, a little more about the process of working on the biography. Had you ever tackled something like this before? And what kind of guidance might you have gotten from your publisher about how to go about navigating a biography?
Yeah, very little. And I designed the book too, and I'd never designed a book. No, I had worked at a woodworking magazine, so at least I'd been writing and editing other people's writing. And I went to another story, but before I went to the College of Redwoods, I was a graduate student at UC San Diego. My father was a writer, so I did have at least writing in my blood to some extent, and knew how to edit and at least write, directly, maybe somewhat journalistically. And then it's hard to see, but there's two shelves here of books that I bought for the process of doing the research. I read a few biographies, the ones that stick out. My dad actually took a class with Alex Haley, who was Malcolm X's biographer. But no, I didn't have that much guidance from the publisher. It's a unique book, for better or worse, among Lost Art Press's books. It's really the only biography that they have. But yeah, it was a labor of love. I said that I was approached to write the book, but I think, within a few phone calls and some reading, I realized that it was going to be really, really engaging. And you can see tonight I had a lot to talk about, but I still can't help talk about his early life and just how, I had to refresh and read into the minutia of the Russian Revolution, and when, the Civil War, when the whites and greens were fighting in Siberia. It's like the life just goes everywhere. So it's hard not to,
Tina has raised a question here. What do you think was Krenov's greatest asset?
It's a big question. Greatest asset. Well, okay. So, there's the practical thing, which is that his ability to talk about what he did, or to be an inspiring teacher, talker, lecturer, whatever that is. Learning that he dictated his books. At least Cabinet Maker's Notebook was dictated, which to me made a lot of sense when I learned that. But really, that it was that gift of talking eloquently and inspirationally about what he did that certainly seemed to shape both his teaching career and his writing career, which really one wouldn't have happened without the other to a certain extent. Certainly, if we follow Craig McCart and how he found Jim, and then the eventual teaching at RIT, and how that fed into him writing the books. And so that maybe that's an answer to his greatest asset. And what do I think gave him that skill? I see Tina wrote. That's a great question. I don't know. How does anyone become a great speaker or a great writer? His mother was a writer. Tina has her memoirs there. And you can see a little bit of how his mother wrote her memoirs and how Jim was writing certainly his early stories. So he was definitely influenced a lot by how his mother favored writing, and learned a lot from her, and clearly was well educated by his parents, even in remote Alaska. Read a lot and learned a lot. So even with, a high school education, he graduated high school at 20, so he was 2 years behind. And on paper, you might think maybe he wasn't a good student, but I suspect the opposite was true, and that he was a very, a good, sharp young mind, certainly by the writing that he did at the time. So, yeah, I don't know what gave him that skill, but it came from somewhere. Oh, good. And I can see another question. I'll read it out loud. Brendan, wonderful job on the biography. Thank you, David. Uh, where do you teach, and how did your time at the Krenov School inform your current teaching? So I do teach woodworking classes. I actually, since the pandemic, I've only taught 2 or 3. I teach small private, or not private, but at small schools, so week-long, 7-day, 5-day, 3-day classes. I was teaching a lot of them before the pandemic in Kentucky, where I was based. I actually teach, the most recent class I taught was on ash basket weaving, which is something I do a lot now. How did your time at the Krenov School inform your current teaching? Well, we had great teachers. I know at least, I think 2 of them are here. Watching people teach, or being a student, is a fabulous way to learn at least an idea of how to be a teacher. I didn't watch, we watched some videos of Krenov's lectures, and I certainly watched many more and listened to many more in the process of writing this book. A hard thing to imitate. I'm not sure anyone can copy it. Certainly the philosophy of the school, being close to the source of your materials, or understanding, working with your material rather than against it. In the job where I teach or help now, quite a bit of what we do multimedia. So we have metal and wood, and we run CNC machines and lathes and table saws and have workbenches. So we're doing a lot of different work, and a lot of what I have to do with students is channel their intentions to the right set of processes, which I think is something that Krenov School did well. We had machines and we had handwork. We may not have had CNCs, which is, having worked with them a lot, I don't really like them. But
I'm sorry, that was my ankle. You know my ankle.
we've got Tina talking here. We can hear you, Tina.
Sorry, sorry. How do I mute myself? I don't know.
Oh, I think David may be able to.
I can mute you, Tina.
Thank you.
But so channeling student intentions and student goals to the right techniques, the right tools or medium or processes, or they approach me and say, I want to make a chair, and look, I bought all this cool insulation foam. And you can say, well, isn't that, let's look at wood, or let's, you've never worked with wood before. Well, let's not try to make a Chippendale chair. Let's look for something simpler. Or that's very elementary in where I work. I'm in an art department, so the furniture making is not our main focus, but certainly learning to channel intention to material and ways of working is something I learned there, and something sort of dear to Krenov's philosophy. He had a particular approach and a particular medium. But he was also, I mentioned Rob Sperber, who's one of his students who went into metalworking, and Jim was actually a big part of convincing Rob to pursue metalworking. As funny as we think, like, Rob came to Jim to learn woodworking, and a few years later was doing metalwork. But this is a phone call I had 6 years ago, so I'm stretching a little bit, but I think I remember Rob saying effectively, that Jim, even when he wasn't going to work in the same medium as Jim, and that Jim could see he wanted to work differently, that he wanted to do something else, that wood wasn't going to be his thing, that, so it wasn't, Jim wasn't just pointing students at his direction necessarily. And I know if people are familiar with some of our alumni, there are students like the people that come to mind, Brian Newell and Young Chan, who do woodwork that's, almost as far away from Jim as you can get in many ways, but are, dear students of Jim's, and were influenced by the school. So it oftentimes people were accused of making Krenovian woodwork. But even a cursory sort of familiarity with the school, you can realize that maybe that's not fair.
And Brendan, I just want to say that being at the exhibit at the Grace Hudson Museum, it is obvious that There's been some criticism of the Krenov School in terms of, oh, they teach, they make students do Krenovian work. They encourage students to do Krenovian cabinets, and it's just a copycat kind of a program. But looking at the exhibit and the retrospective of the school, it's clearly true that the students of the school have explored many different venues and branched out in many different ways to create their own kind of art. And it's really encouraging. And I hope this exhibit will put an end to that notion that the Krenov School only encourages copycats.
Yes, and yeah, certainly. And I suspect that that was an early criticism that stuck around longer than it should have in the mind of a certain generation of woodworkers, because certainly now, knowing students who are coming out of the school in the past few years since I was there, there's a lot. I won't mention names. There's a lot. Maddie and Sarah and everyone, Hugh, all these students who've come are doing incredible work that, and under Laura's guidance, there's incredible work happening now. And I mean, or even early attendees. I know I saw Paul Reiber in the attendance. Yes. Paul is an absolutely incredible wood carver.
Going their own way. I love it.
Yeah, definitely. I see there's another Q&A that popped up, which was a favorite Krenov piece for David and Brendan. I put one on the cover of my book that I got to see, which is down with Katya in North Carolina, which is an absolutely incredible, the No Glass showcase. I built one myself kind of as a meditation. I didn't exactly try to be a perfect replicant of that piece, but it's one of the most, it's an amazing piece of furniture to be around, and I absolutely love it. It's hard to choose one. It's just the one that's on the cover. At the back of my book, to be a real salesman. But one thing that I insisted on, I didn't have to fight hard for it. But one thing I really insisted on was at the back of the book, there's a catalog of at least several, I don't know, there might be 2 or 3 dozen cabinets and pieces of Jim's over the years, and including some that I think were effectively unknown or hadn't been photographed before or hadn't been correctly attributed, at least the very, very early things. That was really important to me for the book, and also something I look back at quite a bit. The same way that I look all the time at the Krenov School website at old student work. Whenever I think about making a table or a chair, or have an idea for something, I sometimes go peek in the archive and go look at what students have done in the past to get ideas. But yeah, the easy one for me is No Glass Showcase, maybe. That's it.
And that one, of course, is with my sister now, and it was very special, and Jim kept it.
Right.
He didn't sell it ever. We inherited that, so it was very special to him.
Yes. Yeah, and you have Bits of Maple, which might be one of my other favorite pieces.
Yeah.
Looking for the picture of it now, which is almost sort of a mosaic collage piece that Jim did with a number of small little, it's wrong to call them scraps of wood because they're so perfectly presented, but here's
it was so whimsical. It was just not like him. He made 2 of those cabinets, and he painted the inside of the cabinet, which he has never ever done before or since. He painted one in green and one in sort of an orange red, and that was it. He never made any cabinet like that again, so it's very special to me.
Yeah, it's an amazing piece. So that one is 1962, and the No Glass Showcase, which he also called A Playful Thing, I think is 1977. Now I'm flipping back to the page. 1977, yeah. I've still got some dates and notes stuck in my head that I can't shake loose.
Brendan,
Some
we're
other pieces that really stand out to me that are sort of lost and I don't know where they are the clocks that he made. He made 2 clocks with sort of wood chains hanging down the clock clock faces, and one of them displayed the minute and the hour, I believe, and one of them just the hour. But anyway, they were really unique and they were really beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't, I did at various points try to track down certain pieces, and I was really lucky to find the cabinet from 1960 that was in that newspaper. But a friend, actually someone I met in the process of writing the book, had that cabinet and had been given it, but it was potentially misattributed, or he wasn't really sure that it was a Krenov cabinet because it was so early and so different than the later cabinets. And then we have Harley. The Sachs family is still using Harley Sachs's silverware, dovetailed silverware box, which was in circa 1959. They're not even really sure when he made it, but Krenov made that for his friend Harley while still in school. So that's truly an early piece. But sorry, David, I think you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was saying we're at 26 minutes after the hour. We've gone way long here. And I want to first get a couple of other notes in from people. Laura Mays writes, "Thank you for the biography, Brendan. I refer to it all the time."
Good.
And also David Hawk has also posted in the chat the address of the Krenov archive, the krenovarchive.org, another wonderful resource and for people.
Yeah. And I said it was important that I had a gallery in the book, but truly the definitive gallery and the place that I spend a lot of time on, and certainly was really helpful. The Krenov Foundation too was really helpful in process of writing.
Really encourage people to go to the Krenov archive site and the Krenov Foundation site. Wonderful information there.
Yeah, definitely.
Brendan, I think I'll just try to wrap things up here by making another comment about your book. If it wasn't for your book, we would not have done this exhibition.
Oh, well, that's
and I'll tell you, I'll just want to share a story. Carrie Marshall, who was on the Krenov Foundation board for a long time, was a student at the school, became one of the members of our advisory committee, was over at the Grace Hudson Museum doing some work that we had asked him to do here. And he brought up that the Krenov School had celebrated its 40th anniversary a year or two before then, and got us talking about that. And the next time Carrie showed up at the museum, which was a few months later, he presented me with your book.
Oh.
And number one, I was impressed that how wonderful, beautiful it looks. But over the next few days, I started reading it, and it's a wonderfully written book. And the story you tell about James Krenov and his youth, and that whole passage, his pathway that got him not only to America but to the Redwood College of the Redwoods School. It's just fabulous. It's a very compelling read. And I shared it with Alyssa, and it in the exhibition took off from there.
Well, thank you.
So yeah.
Appreciate that.
So Brendan, thank you for spending so much time with us tonight. Thank you to all the attendees for spending a part of your evening with us as well. I see so many people have hung on to the bitter end here. So we really appreciate you. I want to thank again everybody in the audience tonight. I want to thank Alyssa for participating in the program tonight. Again, the advisory committee for all the work they put into it. I want to thank the Krenov Foundation and the Krenov School for being great sponsors of the exhibition, as well as our Sun House Guild here at the museum and our museum members. So thanks again, everybody. We'll stop this and then look for, and here's Alyssa, ready to say goodbye again. All right. Thanks again, everybody, and I'll wish you all a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thank you
Good
so
night.
much.